So welcome back, everybody. Thanks for attending day 2 of our NISAR ISRO Community Workshop. So today we are going to sort of pick up where we left off. Forrest will go over a few different InSAR analyses such as SBAS and persistent scatter time series. Then we'll have a short QA session where we can go over any questions that have come up regarding the topic of InSAR or technical issues that you possibly faced setting up your accounts in preparation of today's workshop. And then Forrest is going to walk through the MintPy notebook that we'll be running our own data through to sort of just explain what we're doing in MintPy and each of the steps in the process, and then we'll actually then we'll take a short break, and then we'll run through the notebook as a group. And so everybody who has prepared an SBAS stack can download those data into Open Science Lab, and then we'll run through the MintPy notebook so you can get a cumulative deformation time series of your from your stack, and then we'll have a short wrap up. And so our timing was a little bit off yesterday, and I think that that's just fine. We'll just sort of take it as it comes, and if we wrap up a little early, that's okay. And if we need to stay a little late, I'll be on hand to stay and answer questions after the fact. So we can just take the schedule with a grain of salt, I think. And with that, I'll kick it over to Forrest.
Great, thanks, Alex. So yeah, looking forward to talking about time series InSAR today. It's kind of my bread and butter. I really enjoy the work and happy to share a little bit about it for you all. Let me just get to the right section in the slides here. We have to buzz through a little bit here first. All right, so time series InSAR. So just a quick outline of what we're going to talk about during this session. We're going to talk first about why you might want to perform time series InSAR analyses versus just looking at single InSAR images. The second thing we'll look at is the different methods that you can use for time series analysis, mainly persistent scatter, distributed scatter, or PS and DS combined. And then we're going to talk about some of the error analyses and corrections that you can do for InSAR time series. And these end up being quite important because there are some pretty strong signals from other factors other than deformation that we have to account for. So why InSAR time series analyses? And the main reason that we're doing this is trying to increase the relative strength of the deformation signal in comparison to the other types of signals that we find in interferograms. And so this will help decrease the impact of correlation. It'll increase the overall accuracy of our estimated displacement signal, and it will also help us understand the temporal evolution of ground displacement that we measure. And this is particularly important because a lot of the type of deformation signals that we can monitor with InSAR, it's really powerful if we can know how they're evolving over time, such as, is inflation at this volcano increasing or decreasing over time, or is creeping movement on this fault increasing or decreasing over time, or are we seeing a sharp spike in the displacement rates at a landslide that could signal a catastrophic failure sometime in the future. So one of the most important things to remember when we're talking about increasing the accuracy of the estimated displacement signal in InSAR analyses is that the phase that an interferogram actually measures actually represents a couple of different factors. And this is something we covered in the InSAR section yesterday, but an interferogram represents a phase change related to the displacement we're actually interested in, changes in the atmospheric conditions, changes in the geometry that we're observing the land from, differences in the scattering behavior of the scene that we're looking at, and some noise components as well. And the important thing to think about is that all of the factors that we're typically not interested in, atmosphere, geometry, scattering, and noise, are not correlated through time, i.e. there isn't a consistent signal that they have as time progresses. You know, there isn't like a linear increase in any of them as time goes on. And so what this means is that if we analyze our InSAR phase changes in the time domain, we see that a lot of the noise components contribute sort of a random scattering, but it's only the actual displacement component that we're actually interested in that has some sort of linear trend. And so doing time series InSAR analyses is a really strong and effective tool for discriminating between the displacement component of the phase change and all the other components. And so just to give you an example of what that looks like, here is an X-band interferogram formed from two SAR images that are roughly 2.5 years apart. This is just like the basic InSAR kind of analysis that we described earlier on. And you can see that there aren't consistent fringes anywhere in this image, maybe a little bit there you can see, maybe a tiny bit there, but overall, it's pretty decorrelated. There aren't very many consistent patterns. If we form the same interferogram using a time series approach, however, we can see that the decorrelation has gone way down. We're seeing much more consistent phase signals and clear fringes throughout the image. And this is an example of the fact that, you know, there's so many factors here that are contributing to the phase signal that it's kind of a mess. But when we look at through time and we can discriminate signals that are consistently changing throughout time versus ones that just randomly change as we vary the temporal component, that we can use that to really separate out the signal, the deformation signal that we're actually interested in, and get a really good idea of what's actually happening in this area. So, and here's another example of the same thing, where basically you could imagine that all the noise components we're not interested in, you know, the DEM air, atmospheric changes, noise, scattering, would be kind of like randomly distributed along this line, but it's only the displacement that has this continuous change through time. And here, you know, is another example of an interferogram over, I believe this is the Galapagos Islands, that is heavily influenced by the atmospheric component. But when we derive a velocity map where we're able to remove that component, you know, we can see very clear signals of inflation and maybe a dike intrusion here happening throughout these islands. So the important thing to start with for all time series analyses is that there are two main camps that all InSAR time series analyses fall under. And those two camps are really discriminated between based on the properties of the scene that you're actually observing. And the kind of the big difference is your scene dominated by distributed scatterers or persistent or permanent scatterers. And I'll describe both of these in detail now. So let's start with permanent scatterers, since they're kind of a bit easier to explain. So when you look at a single pixel in a SAR image or an InSAR image, different actual physical things on the Earth's surface will contribute differently to the strength of the signal returned. For instance, a meadow or a grassland will not have very many scatterers in the scene that will reflect a strong signal back, because they're kind of diffuse scatterers where the signal will go in, bounce throughout the volume of the grass or the trees, and then you won't get a single strong return off of it. Conversely, as Heidi mentioned, urban areas that have a ton of buildings can actually produce very, very strong return signals due to the double bounce effect, where a signal is coming in from the sensor, it hits the ground, bounces up, hits the side of the building, and comes right back. And in that case, we get an incredibly strong return from just one part of the SAR image cell, because there's such a strong reflection off of one particular surface. And most of these surfaces that reflect very strongly and return a strong signal back to the SAR image are also relatively stable through time. So for instance, this would be double bounce off of buildings, a double bounce off of a sharp rock face in a natural setting, or sometimes you can also see this off of ships that are dry docked at ports or things like that. And in that case, we call those permanent scatterers because they are reflecting a very strong signal back to the SAR satellite consistently over time. And so, for instance, if you look at this, here's kind of a graphical illustration up in the right-hand corner of what that SAR resolution cell would look like, where basically you might have a few smaller contributors to the signal returned from that cell in the SAR image, but you really have one particular physical entity that is contributing most of the return. And that entity is staying relatively stable through time. And because it's so large and really dominates the cell, we see that the phase remains super consistent in these areas. So for instance, if we look at a series of InSAR or SAR acquisitions through time, and we look at the phase returned at that point, we see that, you know, there isn't much change or much noise in that signal because it's dominated by one scatterer that has a very, very strong return. However, there are these other class of scatterers that remain relatively consistent through time, but they don't return very strong signals. And in this case, this might be something like a grassland with very short grass, or even like a savanna type scenario. And in this case, we have many scatterers that remain relatively consistent, but not nearly consistent as a permanent scatterer. And if you would look at a SAR image cell dominated by distributed scatterers, these kind of many small scatterers that remain somewhat correlated through time, you can see that there is more scatter or more noise in the measurement, but they do have a somewhat consistent history through time. So the initial time series analyses were developed with permanent scatterers in mind. This made sense because these were the easiest points to get relatively consistent measurements from. And so the techniques were developed were, okay, let's look at the phase history of these permanent scatterers through time, and then develop analysis methods for turning individual interferograms at these PS points into a time series of deformation information. However, you know, as you can imagine, if you're limiting yourself to buildings and rock outcrops and things like that as sources of your permanent scatterers, there's going to be a lot of areas of the Earth where you aren't going to be able to perform time series InSAR analyses because those types of features just aren't present. And to fill this hole, that was when these distributed scatterer methodologies were developed, I believe, a couple of years later after the initial persistent scatterer paper came out. And in this case, what we do is we use spatial averaging to increase, to basically reduce the amount of noise or scatter in these DS points. And so what this looks like is for permanent scatterer time series analyses, you're typically identifying the persistent or permanent scatterers that exist in your scene, and then doing time series analyses at the native resolution of the SAR imagery. However, on the distributed scatterer side, we're using spatial averaging or multi-looking to actually reduce the noise in the scatter. But in order to do that, we have to basically reduce the overall resolution of our analysis. So for example, what that means is that PS analyses are typically conducted with 10-meter resolution cells, which is about the native resolution of Sentinel-1 SAR imagery. But a DS analysis will typically multi-look the interferograms to a point where the resolution is about 100 meters by 100 meters. And this 100 meter by 100 meter averaging means that the phase history of the distributed scatterers becomes much more consistent, but you do lose a lot of resolution in the process. And this can be a problem if you're trying to look at very small features, but in general, the benefits often outweigh the costs, especially because the alternative is typically you can't perform a time series analysis at all in that area. And then the final class of InSAR time series analyses is really combining these two techniques, basically taking the best of both worlds and saying, okay, where we do have these persistent scatterers or permanent scatterers, let's work at the native resolution of the SAR imagery. But when we are in an area that is more dominated by distributed scatterers, let's do higher amounts of spatial averaging and leverage distributed scatter techniques to get coarser resolution estimates of the deformation in those areas. And one other thing that's important to know about DS versus PS workflows is the type of interferograms you need to generate in order to conduct these analyses. Now, in general, the PS interferogram networks, which are shown over here, are relatively simple. Both of these graphs are set up in a relatively similar way. You have basically the date that a given SAR acquisition was collected, represented by these small diamonds. And then on the y-axis, you have the perpendicular baseline, or how far the satellite was apart from, basically how far the satellite was between any two acquisitions in reference to a particular reference image. And in this case, in both of these graphs, each line connecting one of these diamonds or one of these circles over here represents an interferogram that you're forming. So because the permanent scatter points are relatively coherent and don't change much through time, there isn't a lot of point in creating redundancy in a PS network, or basically forming interferograms that use redundant combinations of imagery in order to form a network. And so what you see here is you pick one particular reference SAR image, and then you form interferograms between that SAR image and all the other SAR images in your analysis. So for instance, if you have one reference image and 10 secondary SAR images, you will be forming a total of 10 interferograms. And this works because the permanent scatterers are so coherent through time that making more interferograms than that is just a waste of processing time, because you're not going to be getting any new information typically.
Hey, Forrest, there's a question in chat, which is for the PS baseline, is going more than 300 meters okay, or do we have to stick to 300 meters similar to an SBAS?
So perpendicular baselines matter less for PS techniques, just because, you know, the scattering of the PS points is so consistent that geometric errors are really less common or much easier to correct, in particular for PS. So, you know, while perpendicular baseline, keeping relatively small perpendicular baselines is generally a good idea, it's a bit easier to work with larger baselines when you're working with a PS analysis. In general, what I would recommend is process all interferograms that you basically can, even if they do have very large perpendicular baselines. And then when you're actually conducting your time series analyses, look and see if those interferograms with very large perpendicular baselines are contributing excess noise to the analysis. And if they are, throw them out at that time. But I think in general, I prefer to keep them in for a PS analysis. And in particular, in general, you don't have to worry about the perpendicular baseline when working with Sentinel-1 data, because the orbital tube is so small that you really never get super large perpendicular baselines. But this does become something that you'll need to worry about if you start working with ALOS-1 or ALOS-2 SAR data, because this comes up quite a lot. All right, so that's a PS network. And then over on the left here, we have a distributed scatter network. And once again, the graph is laid out the same way, where we have the time of the SAR imagery collection on the x-axis and the perpendicular baseline on the y-axis. And once again, each dot represents a SAR acquisition, and each line in the plot represents a particular interferogram that you're forming. Now, because distributed scatterers have a less consistent signal in general, that means that their coherence is going to degrade faster over time. And basically, these very long interferograms, say from, in this case, mid-1992 to about mid-1995, are probably going to be completely decoherent if you're working with distributed scatterers. And so in this case, we use a technique called small baseline subset time series analysis, or SBAS for short. And the small baseline phrase in that name basically comes from the fact that we're only using a subset of the interferograms that we could form that have very small temporal baselines. So typically in this case, you're working with interferogram pairs that have temporal baselines or separation between the two images that you're using of less than 45 days, because anything much longer than that will lead to almost complete decorrelation in the images. So in this case, you'll notice that we're connecting between many different neighboring SAR images to form our network, and we don't have one central reference image that we're forming interferograms between. And that's because, this temporal decay and coherence is such a big issue for distributed scatterers. So what we do in this case is we form as many close interferogram pairs as we can, and then we use a least squares inversion technique to actually go from a network that looks like this to a time series of deformation that looks somewhat like this, where all of our deformation is referenced to a single SAR acquisition. And as we work with the NumPy software, this is a type of graph that you will become very familiar with, as it's one of the main outputs that you'll look at to determine the overall quality of the interferogram network that you've created. So this is just a quick example of what PS selection looks like. So for instance, here's an optical image of a particular section of the world that is dominated mainly by city regions. And here you can see something called the amplitude dispersion, or basically you can think of it as similar to the standard deviation of the SAR amplitude through time. And what you see here is that in areas that are very dense urban areas, where the buildings are facing towards the SAR sensor, you get these very, very bright points. And these are the persistent scatterers in our scene. So basically the first step of a persistent scatterer analysis would be you pick some threshold for your amplitude dispersion, in this case 0.42, and all of the white dots are what you're going to be working with for your actual analysis. But one thing you can clearly see is that, say, in the forested areas up here, you're basically getting no information on the time series of deformation. And this is one of the reasons why you might want to do a distributed scatterer analysis. And so here's a quick example of what it looks like when you actually perform the least squares inversion that gets you from that complicated network that we showed for distributed scatterers to a much simpler network, such as the one you're forming when doing persistent scatterers. Basically what we're doing is we're using linear algebra to look at the overall phase of all interferometric pairs for a particular point. We're building a design matrix of basically interferogram pairs to determine the relationships between all of them. And then the output we eventually want to get to is a single reference interferogram between each state and a singular reference image. And we use typical least squares inversion techniques to basically do the inversion of this equation to get the information we want. And if you want to go deeper into how these equations work and how the math is actually done, I'd recommend checking out Bernardino's et al. Paper, I believe from 2003. But I can link this in chat later on so you guys can all have access to that paper. So here's another example of what the two techniques kind of look like. And in this case, we're comparing just a persistent scatterer only approach to a persistent scatterer plus distributed scatterer approach. And so here you can see, go ahead, Alex.
Sorry, there's another question. And I'm a little unclear on the wording. But I think the question relates to is there a guideline for choosing a particular temporal baseline for for distributed scatterer analysis?
Right. So my own preference when doing distributed scatterer networks is typically not making too harsh of a temporal baseline cutoff immediately. Typically what I will do is say, okay, let's form interferograms between each SAR acquisition and its 3 neighboring pairs in time. And depending on the collection strategy of Sentinel-1 in your location, this could have temporal baselines ranging from 6 to 24 days, or sometimes up to between 12 and 48 or 56 days. And then once I formed all those interferograms, what I will do is then use the MinPy software to calculate the average spatial coherence for that interferometric pair. And so that will end up being some number between 0 and 1 on average for the area of interest I'm looking at. And then typically what I'll do is set some threshold, say like I only want to use interferograms in my analysis that have an average spatial coherence of 0.6. And any pairs that do not meet that threshold, I will throw out. An important caveat there, though, is that it's really important to always make sure that you're maintaining a connected network. So, for instance, if you look at this graph here, you wouldn't want to ever have a case where there are no InSAR pairs that connect the dates before 2008 to after 2008. You always want to make sure that there is at least one pair connecting the two. And that's to ensure that you can have a linked deformation history through time. If you don't have at least a couple InSAR pairs that connect over a given time span, it becomes very difficult to produce accurate time series deformation estimates. And so that's why I typically say, okay, always make the 3 interferograms closest in time, because that will ensure that you at least start with a fully connected network. And then from there, you can remove interferograms as necessary if they don't have high enough coherence. Hopefully that answers the question. But yeah, just going back to this, here's an example of the different densities of time series deformation points that you might expect from a PS-only analysis versus a PS-DS analysis. In the future, probably, I imagine the recommendation will be that most people should be using a combined PS and DS analysis, but the software for performing these kind of analyses is still a little immature and still being built, unfortunately. However, efforts like the JPL Opera work are building these types of PS and DS combined time series analysis tools that are fully open source. I believe the University of Miami InSAR group is also building one as well. And so these might be some good options to look at combined PS and DS algorithms. But I think for the actual workshop today, we'll focus on a DS only technique. But I think once you understand the concepts behind distributed scatterer techniques, it's not too big of a jump to go to a combined technique. So here's just like a quick flowchart view of what a typical PS plus DS analysis goes from. So you'll start with a stack of co-registered SAR single look complex images. And then you'll basically use some statistical analyses to determine neighborhoods that are internally homogeneous. And basically, this will help you discriminate, okay, which points in my SAR imagery are distinctly PS points that are have their own distinct signature in the imagery and remain relatively consistent through time, versus what are my areas that have more distributed scatterers that I will need to do some additional averaging on in order to create relatively coherent information. And then for each of these individually, you create a time series inversion for both the PS points and the DS points. And then because these two data sets are complementary, they don't have any overlap, you can then, once both of them have been, you've performed the time series inversion for both of them, you can recombine them to form a single phase series and then perform your final phase unwrapping before actually looking at the time series. And then you can apply any post corrections that you need to apply, such as corrections for the tropospheric noise or DEM errors. So the next thing we should talk about is that even though time series InSAR is a really powerful technique for reducing the amount of contribution from other sources of phase change, such as atmosphere or geometry, we still see effects of these factors in the InSAR time series that we produce. And so it's also really important that you apply corrections to your final InSAR time series for DEM error and then atmospheric effects that we often will call propagation delay. So I'm just going to cover a few of the basic ones that you might want to consider, and all of these corrections can be applied directly within MinPy, which is the SBAS time series software that we're going to be using later on. So the first thing to look at is error related to the geometry component of the phase that we get in an InSAR image. And this component basically comes from two sources. One, errors in our understanding of where the SAR satellite was located when the imagery was collected, and two, errors in the digital elevation model that we're using to actually get our information on the elevation characteristics of the scene that we're observing. And so you might remember from our discussion on InSAR yesterday that in order to that basically, if you have any difference in perpendicular baseline in the two SAR images you're using to form an interferogram, there will be some component of the phase that is related to that change in position that actually reflects some information about the topography and not actual information about the deformation in that zone. And while we can use external digital elevation models and information about where the satellites were located when they collected the data to correct a lot of this error, if there's any error in our information about where that satellite was located, or there are errors in that digital elevation model, we can still have remaining phase errors related to the geometry that we'll need to correct. And a lot of how these corrections are typically done is by correlating our resulting time series deformation history with the local elevations. And by looking at the correlation between the elevation of a particular area or the change in elevation in a particular zone and the phase time series in that area, we can start to correct for some of those errors, because we can assume that if we have any signal in our time series that looks like the local topography, it's probably related to these geometry errors. And so here, for example, is an example of looking at a corrected and an uncorrected InSAR time series that's been corrected for the geometry error. So here through time, we have the line of sight displacements. Remember that the deformation information that we're getting from InSAR analyses is always along the line of sight of the satellite. So here's the uncorrected version. You can see there's a lot of scatter throughout the signal, even though, there's maybe a trend there. But here, once we've done the actual DEM or geometry correction, you can see that the signal is much more consistent and aligns well with the eruptions at or of the volcano where this imagery was collected. Okay, and then the next source of error that we want to talk about is tropospheric delay. And the majority of tropospheric delay is introduced due to the difference in the amount of water content, the difference in the amount of water content in the troposphere between the two images that were used to perform InSAR in that particular interferogram. And so what this is probably for Sentinel-1 C-band SAR data. This is the dominant error component inside of time series InSAR analyses. For instance, here's one example of the line of sight deformation for a particular point in a time series InSAR analysis before a tropospheric correction was applied, and then after a tropospheric correction was applied. Now, there's typically two different ways that you can correct for the tropospheric delay in SAR images. One is that you can use external weather models to make some estimate about how much water content was in the air between at a particular time. And then you can use that information to calculate what the phase delay would be in that area and subtract the phase delay between the two acquisition times to basically get a component of the time series for that particular time span that you expect to be related to delays in the troposphere. The second way you can do it is a more empirical method. And this empirical method is basically on the idea that as you basically move up through the troposphere, there's less distance between you and the SAR satellite, basically less troposphere or less moisture between you and the SAR satellite. So if you look at the trend of your InSAR measurements as your elevation increases, you can actually create an empirical regression between basically your rate of change of the deformation and the elevation of a particular area. And by doing this, you can get an empirical estimate of how much delay or phase component there is being contributed by the troposphere. And MinPy supports both methods. An important caveat here is that you need to be careful about thinking about the type of signal you're trying to measure when doing tropospheric delay corrections, particularly if you're using the empirical method that uses elevation information. You want to be careful if you expect that your deformation signal is correlated with elevation. This comes up a lot with volcanoes. So for instance, a lot of times we'll try to measure the inflation of volcanoes with InSAR analyses. And typically inflation at a lot of volcanoes is highest at the cone or the very peak of the volcano and lowest kind of at the surrounding. You kind of get this, this circular pattern of deformation spreading out from the top of the volcano. To this empirical tropospheric delay correction, that looks a lot like a tropospheric delay that we'll try to correct for. So you can actually remove an inflating volcanic signal from a time series analysis if you do the empirical correction at a volcano. Conversely, most of the weather models are relatively coarse. And so they only tend to work well when you're looking at deformation over very large areas. In particular, this works very well if you're looking at fault creep or something like that over, say, the San Andreas Fault. But I myself have encountered issues when using weather model-based tropospheric corrections when looking at landslides because they're relatively small. And the weather models that we use for these corrections sometimes have errors at the scale of landslides themselves. And so they'll introduce noise that makes it difficult to discriminate landslide signals from non-landslide areas if you apply these type of tropospheric corrections. And if people are interested in how to correct for troposphere when you're working with very small features, I'm happy to go into that later on in Q&A. But this is tropospheric correction. This is a really important correction that you'll need to make for Sentinel-1 C-band data. But luckily, it's a little bit less of a factor for the L-band data that NISAR is going to be producing. On the other side, however, there is ionospheric delay. And the ionosphere is a higher level of the atmosphere of the troposphere. And most of the air or the phase contributed by ionospheric delays is related to the total electrical content of this area of the atmosphere. And in general, this air source contributes much more to the air of L-band data than to C-band data. So for C-band data, this is a relatively small component. If you expect that there could be some errors contributed, it might be worth correcting for this, but it's not always necessary with C-band data, but it's basically absolutely required with L-band data. And I believe NISAR is actually going to be giving you a ionospheric correction layer right off the top, and it won't be something you have to produce for yourself when NISAR data comes out. An interesting thing about the ionospheric delay is that it affects different frequencies of SAR data differently. And in particular, there's a very dramatic change in how the ionospheric delay affects different frequencies. And we can use this to our advantage. And in particular, we can use something called a split spectrum correction in order to do this. Basically, we form interferograms with SAR data at the lower range of our frequency for a given SAR acquisition. And then we form at the same location with the same base SAR imagery, another interferogram using only information from the higher end of the frequency that we have. And then by basically taking the difference of those two interferograms, we can get an estimate of the ionospheric delay in this area. And so, for instance, here's an example of what that looks like. This is an interferogram for a magnitude 8.8 earthquake that occurred in Chile back in 2010. Here we have the base interferogram generated using ALOS-1 data. Here's the ionospheric delay computed using this split spectrum range analysis. And then here's the actual coseismic displacement. And you can see that, the strength of these signals is relatively similar, and that, this was a major component of the initial InSAR signal that we got. So that's ionospheric delay. Once again, many SAR processors will allow you to make these corrections. I believe that ICE2 in particular has an ionospheric correction step that you can use if you want to use it yourself. I don't know if you can do ionospheric corrections natively inside of MIPI or not. That might be something I have to check. But luckily, it's not too big of an issue for Sentinel-1 C-band data. And so that's it. That's a brief kind of whirlwind tour of time series InSAR for deformation analyses. Just to cover the basics again, time series InSAR analyses does a really good job of discriminating between deformation signals that are typically correlated through time and other sources of phase contributions that tend not to be correlated through time, such as atmospheric effects, noise, and geometric effects. In general, you'll have to pick between three different techniques: persistent scatterer, time series InSAR, distributed scatterer, time series InSAR, and PSDS PSDS combined methods. In general, DS methods are where you want to start. They work for the widest variety of land cover, land use types. They're relatively robust, and there's really great software available for doing these analyses. But if you start working in urban areas, I'd maybe start considering a PS analysis. And in the future, keep a lookout for PS and DS combined software, because I believe that will be a growing, really powerful technique in the future. Just to mention, a lot of the figures that I used in today's presentation come from a really great presentation that Forrest of JPL gave last year. And if you want to go ahead and watch his version talking about some of the same stuff, you can go ahead and click on this hyperlink here, and it will take you to a YouTube video of his discussion of time series InSAR theory. All right, and with that, I think we're gonna take a pause to do some Q&A about getting everybody's environment set up so they're ready to work with the notebooks. And if we have any lingering time series InSAR questions, I'm also happy to give those now, answer some of those now.
Great. Yes, and there are a couple of questions in the QA session here, so that relate to the discussion that we just had. So the first, I'm not entirely clear. So perhaps Dr. Chowdhury, you could elaborate. The question reads, can I say that the slope is perpendicular to the line of sight and parallel to the line of sight through the local incidence angle? If we could just have some clarification of the question on that one. So if the slope is perpendicular to the line of sight, then you've got a 90-degree angle.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're parallel at that moment in time, you're parallel to the path of the sensor.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not sure if
I think I can maybe try it. I don't.
Okay.
So I can talk a little bit about something like the interaction between the local instance angle and your line of sight that ends up being important for InSAR analyses. I don't know if this is exactly his question, but in general, it's very important to always keep in mind that the deformation or movement that you're measuring with InSAR is always along the InSAR's line of sight. And what that means is that if you have deformation along any vector that isn't the line of sight, you're not going to be measuring the full magnitude of that deformation. And in particular, if the line of sight is basically perpendicular to your local slope or the local topography, and movement that you're trying to measure is along that slope. Say if you have a landslide that's moving down slope and you're trying to measure it with a line of sight that looks like this, you're basically going to measure no deformation, because none of the deformation is along the vector that you're actually measuring deformation along. There are tools out there that you can give it information about your line of sight and then a DEM, and it will calculate the effectiveness of InSAR in a particular area if you expect motion to be downslope. And that might be a good thing to look at if you're concerned that the line of sight might not be appropriate for measuring the deformation that you're interested in. Conversely, the best scenario is that you have movement that is parallel with the SAR satellite's line of sight, because basically almost all of the deformation can be measured from the InSAR analysis. But you have to be careful. Even small motions along the line of sight can look like very large signals in comparison. So it's good to keep in mind if you have a ton of alignment between the deformation you're trying to measure in the line of sight. Just knowing that it will kind of bias your analysis to make that deformation look larger in comparison to other sources of deformation.
And perhaps this is the perfect time to take a look at a few slides that Dr. Rao sent a few days ago, sort of demonstrating this issue. And so, looking at this example, there was a significant subsidence and landslide here that we can see in these images. And however, when running an SBAS time series over this area from an ascending and a descending pass of the satellite, there were differences seen in those deformations, and that would relate directly to the fact that we're measuring deformation in the line of sight, and that the incidence angles are different because because you've got different look directions at the same spot, and so it's going to measure deformation along the line of sight from those two different locations, and so you're not going to see see equal deformation, and neither of these are showing a vertical deformation. I believe you can use these two. You could use these two analyses in combination to determine a vertical deformation. Is that correct, Forrest?
You can use ascending and descending InSAR data to make an estimate of the vertical deformation. There are some assumptions you need to make, particularly that there isn't a lot of motion in the north-south direction in order to do that. But in general, that's often a good way to make the line of sight deformation information that you natively get from InSAR analyses into a more understandable format that's a bit more consistent through time. So yeah, and MinPy does actually provide functionality for taking data from an ascending and descending pass of a time series analysis and combine them to get both a vertical and an east-west horizontal component of the motion.
And that is not functionality that we've currently built into any of our example notebooks, but I think that we're seeing this question enough that it might be worth adding to some of our workflows. There's also a question in the QA from Dr. Rao. Do we correct tropospheric delay using atmospheric correction process in OpenSAR lab? And yes, we can. We're using MinPy, which offers that option, and we do provide that as an option. You can either calculate the tropospheric, perform the tropospheric correction, or skip over that step. That is optional.
For those of you who are a bit more fluent in Python, I'm putting into chat a link to the actual code that MinPy uses to convert from an ascending and descending set of time series analyses into vertical and horizontal. If you're kind of interested in how that process works, that's a good place to look. There's also a paper, and I can't remember who published it offhand, that covers it, but if you search vertical horizontal decomposition of InSAR, you should get to that paper.
And so the last question in the QA is, can S and L band NISAR data be used for atmospheric or for ionospheric correction? I believe that we can perform ionospheric correction. We will be able to perform ionospheric correction on the S band and L band data, but it's using the Air 5. One of the Air 5 data sets for, yeah.
So I believe in this case, you're actually using the NISAR data natively to perform the ionospheric corrections.
Oh, okay.
When the NISAR satellite was designed, it was designed knowing that this ionospheric delay was a major problem for L band data. And so when they're actually collecting the NISAR data, they're collecting relatively large bandwidth of data, I think about 20 megahertz typically, 10 to 20 megahertz typically at a lower frequency. And then they're also collecting data at a smaller 5 megahertz frequency as well, but at a much higher frequency. And since you're always collecting these two separate streams of data with NISAR L band data, you can combine them to estimate your ionospheric ionospheric phase delay directly from the NISAR data. I'm very confident that they're doing that for L-band data. For the S-band data, I'm not quite as sure because the S-band data is less affected by the ionosphere, so I'm not sure if they'll be providing corrections for the S-band data.
Right, there was another question that came in last night when one of the participants tried to go through the hype example notebook for using the SDK and ran into some issues installing the hype SDK with Conda. You know, I think copying and pasting these commands into the terminal in OpenSAR Lab, and so this particular notebook that was demonstrated yesterday was not. It's sort of a generalized notebook meant to be run in any environment. It was not specifically designed for OpenSAR Lab, and it's possible that in the base environment of OpenSAR Lab there is a conflict that prevents installing the hype SDK. However, it's you know, installing it in its separate environment that's not in the base Conda environment, you know, does alleviate that situation. And so just creating the InSAR analysis environment that Forrest showed yesterday will allow you to run this notebook. So you would just hop into, let me pull up the screen with OpenSAR Lab in it. Okay, if you were in that notebook, this is a different notebook, but if you're in any notebook in OpenSAR Lab, you can select a new kernel by clicking in the upper right here, and you'll see all of your kernel options. So if you've built that InSAR analysis environment, then you can just select that, and then you can effectively skip over the first steps in this notebook here that recommend you know, performing these installations with either Conda or pip. And does anybody have any? Oh, looks like there are a couple new questions that have popped up. Let's see. How does the time of acquisition play a role in the deformation analysis? What can we remove?
Oh, the atmospheric factor in the dry season.
Yes, yes.
So in general, it's not the amount of moisture in the air that has a large impact on the air of the time series analysis. It's how much the amount of moisture is changing between two particular acquisitions. So for instance, if it was very dry one time and dry and very wet in the next, that's going to introduce a large amount of air into the time series analysis. In general, if the amount of moisture in the troposphere isn't changing through time, then the standard time series inversion will do a really good job of removing that signal from the analysis. It's only when it's changing through time. And in general, you know, doing InSAR analyses over longer time spans is generally more effective at removing sources of air than constraining your analysis to only times where the noise components are very low. You know, more data generally improves the overall quality of analysis. So in general, I would recommend trying to include data over as many seasons and years as possible, knowing that you will have some tropospheric errors that you might have to correct for. I see another question in the Q&A, which is, can you please explain if my landslide slope is north-south, how accurate can we measure line of sight displacement as compared to a landslide slope in the east-west? So this once again relates back to the line of sight question that we were looking at before. So in general, SAR satellites have polar orbits, which basically means that they most of their flight plans are usually north-south roughly. And since the SAR sensor is always kind of looking perpendicular out from the direction it's flying, that means that the line of sight is predominantly vertical and east-west. For this reason, landslides that are almost completely north-south oriented are very difficult to detect and will be a major limitation of InSAR analyses. And so that's something to keep in mind, is that if you're trying to monitor a landslide that is completely north-south, this technique might not be for you. One thing I will note, however, is that I've worked with large landslides, and their motion tends to be relatively complex. So you might have one lobe of the landslide that does have an east-west component, and that you will be able to detect. But always be aware that if you do have landslides that are completely oriented north-south, a lack of deformation identified in an InSAR analysis is likely due more to the geometry of the line of sight vector that you're looking along, and less to do with the actual activity or non-activity at that landslide. There are, in future missions, some proposals to have satellites that don't polar orbit, and that could be a very interesting development and would allow us to track motion along that is predominantly north-south in those cases. And I think that could be really exciting, say in 10 to 20 years when we have that type of data available.
All right, I'm just seeing if we missed any questions in chat. I think everything has been answered, and I don't see any new ones in the Q&A. So does anybody have any additional questions, including questions regarding setting up your, either creating your SBAS stack to follow along later today when we walk through the notebooks, or creating any of the accounts or gaining any of the access to data sets that you need. Now would be a great time for us to sort of tie up any of those loose ends. Okay, hearing no additional questions, I believe that I can pass this back to you, Forrest, for an initial walkthrough of the notebook. And while we do have a break scheduled for immediately after you walk through this notebook, anybody who does wish to process their own SBAS stack will have to download those data, which makes it take some time if your stack is about 100 images deep. So I think it might be best if we, after you walk through the notebook, if we just jump in and do the initial steps of initiating that download, so that while everybody takes their break, their data can be downloaded. And I'll stop sharing.
Okay.
Oh, and except I did actually just see a new question come in. Is there scope for ingesting internal data for APS correction in OpenSAR Lab?
So I can try and answer that. So I believe OpenSAR Lab allows you to upload your own personal data, if you want to use it for corrections. I believe that's a relatively simple process. However, you'll just need to make sure that the atmospheric phase screen information that you do have is in a format that MinPy can understand. And it might take a little bit of extra configuration to get it to read that data, but in general, the barrier for using your own atmospheric phase screen data is not what can OpenSAR Lab do. It's typically more what can MinPy use to apply those corrections. Okay, I'll go ahead and take over sharing again. Okay, so once again, here I am in my OpenSAR Lab instance, and today we're going to be using notebooks, I believe, that are under the notebooks subfolder. You'll then click into
SAR training, actually.
SAR training, my mistake.
So notebooks, and then SAR training, and then English, and
master. And then MinPy, the one entitled, let me expand this so you guys can see the full name. MinPy time series from prepared data stack. Now, an important thing to remember is that, you all requested some InSAR pairs yesterday from Hype. There is a little bit of additional work you'll have to do to prepare your stack for MinPy, but Alex can kind of walk you through those additional steps that need to be taken. Now, just a quick overview of this notebook. Here, we'll go over some of the basics of notebook setup, review some of the processing steps of the main interface you'll be using inside of MinPy to perform your analyses, which is this command line tool called small baseline app.py. The small baseline name comes from the small baseline subset technique, or SBAS. And then you'll run each step of MinPy individually, and I'll give a quick explanation of what each of these steps are and walk you through some additional post-processing analyses you can do to determine the overall quality of the data you produced. And then we'll have a short break, and then Alex will actually walk you through running this notebook. So I think for now, I'll skip kind of some of the setup discussions because Alex will cover these later, but I'll skip right to the overview of MinPy's small baseline app. And one thing I just want to mention right off the top is that MinPy itself has a lot of great documentation. And if you go to github.com/insarlab/MinPy, you can read all about MinPy and read through some of its documentation. I'll go ahead and post this link in chat right now if anybody's interested in checking out the MinPy code. So basically, there are several steps that you can use inside of MinPy. So the first thing is that you provide it with a stack of unwrapped interferograms produced by MinPy along with some auxiliary data. That you can optionally perform network modification, which you can use to remove any poor quality interferograms that you see inside of your network using the tools that MinPy provides. The next thing you'll do is you'll select a reference point for your analysis. And this is a very important point for InSAR analyses in general. The crux of the issue here is that without any other type of external GPS station data, all deformation measurements inside of InSAR are relative. They're relative to a particular point that you pick. And what this means is that you'll always have to select a point that you expect to be relatively stable throughout time and say, okay, for the rest of the analysis, assume that this point has no deformation whatsoever, and then calculate deformation at all other points relative to this location. And there's two characteristics that you typically want this reference point to have. One, you want it to be confidently stable throughout time. And two, you want it to be extremely coherent. So you probably want a temporal coherence for this point somewhere above 0.9. And if you can get it above 0.95 in particular, that's even better. This is important because any errors in the deformation measurement at your reference point will propagate through the rest of your analysis. So if you have a low quality reference point, you're going to be seeing strange signals throughout the deformation pattern in your InSAR time series. So luckily, MinPy provides some really great out-of-the-box ways to select a high-quality reference point. But if you're seeing strange signals in your InSAR analysis, you might want to go in and modify this reference point yourself. So MinPy then also has some additional functionality that you can use to correct any unwrapping errors that you're found in your analysis. I believe we covered unwrapping a little bit yesterday, but since unwrapping is a completely empirical approach, sometimes there are very obvious errors in the unwrapping that are worth correcting in order to create a better time series analysis. One of the major new advancements to the science that MinPy and its creator Yunjin Zheng created was the ability to do some unwrapping error corrections. I played around with this myself. I think this error correction is particularly useful if your scene has several disconnected areas that you're trying to create consistent deformation histories for. In particular, say if you're working with a volcanic island chain, this type of unwrap error correction is incredibly useful. I don't think we'll be applying unwrap error correction in this notebook, but then the next step is the main time series inversion. So this is that step that we covered briefly before, where we're basically taking a stack of interferograms, creating a design matrix, and performing a least squares inversion to get a time series of deformation where we don't have information from 5 different interferograms representing deformation at a particular point in time, but we just have one individual time series, one particular interferogram basically for each time series point. And then once we've done that initial network inversion, we then will apply some of the different types of corrections that we talked about, such as tropospheric delay correction and DEM correction and other things like that. So once again, from the network inversion, we'll actually create an estimate of the temporal coherence for that network, use global atmospheric models or the empirical DEM approach to apply a DEM correction. Optionally, you can remove any large-scale spatial trends in the time series by using phase deramping. I would say be cautious with this one. It can make your interferogram networks look really nice, but doesn't always do the best job of actually producing high-quality data. And then you can apply a topographic residual correction, which is correcting that geometry issue. And then once you've applied all your corrections, you can estimate a final displacement time series, and then use a simple linear regression approach to create a single image with a velocity estimation for each point in your time series analysis scene. So one thing to note right off the bat is, since you'll be using this command line tool, small baseline app.py, a really useful thing to do whenever you start working with a new command line tool, particularly if it's Python based, is run the command name of the tool --help. It will give you a lot of great information about how to actually use the tool that you're going to be using. So in particular, I'm not going to go through all of the information here, but it's really worth taking the time to go through and read the help information for small baseline app.py. It really gives you a lot of information about how to use this tool. And there's 2 particular things I want to point out. One is that there's a series of steps that you need to run sequentially for MinPy to work, but you can optionally start and stop at different points if you're just redoing a part of the analysis. Excuse me, and that's done using these --start or --end or --2 step commands. And so you can pick from any one of these steps of small baseline app and start or stop from a particular point. And so in this case, if you wanted to start, let's say you had already loaded your data and you didn't need to redo that step of the processing, you could instead do --start modify network, and then your processing would begin from the modify network step instead of starting from the load data step again. And then eventually, also there might be end steps such as geocoding that you might not need. And so if you want to start from the beginning but don't want to do the last 3 steps, you could do something like --end geocode. The other thing to know is that in order to specify all the options that you want to use when using small baseline app.py, you're going to be using an external template file, which will provide MinPy the information it needs to run the type of analysis you want. Alex and the rest of the team at OpenSAR Lab have done a really good job of, in this notebook, of walking you through what some of those options are, making sure you don't have to deal with the templates yourself. But just to show you what these templates look like, here's a quick example. This is kind of the default template that MinPy produces. And when you're doing your own analyses and want to do some more customization, you can go in and change some of these values. Say, like, for instance, this is the setting that tells MinPy, okay, how many different workers do you want to use when you're parallel processing? If you have a really big computer, you might want to bump that up to 24, or if you're working on a smaller computer, bring it down to about 4. But you can use this to customize the type of workflow that you're actually using. For instance, if we scroll down to the troposphere section of this configuration file, you can specify which type of correction you want to use. For instance, you can specify PIAPS here, and that will use one of these weather model based corrections to actually do the troposphere corrections, or you can specify height correlation, and this will use the empirical DEM based correction for MinPy. So in general, I recommend putting these most of these settings with auto, running one pass through, and kind of looking at the overall quality of the analysis, and then changing these as you see fit. And the way you actually specify using one of these templates is just if you have something like --end geocode, you then just give it the path to the configuration file you want to use. So in this case, it would be /small baseline app.cfg. And this would go ahead and run the configuration file with the configurations that you've specified. This value is the default. So if you run small baseline app without specifying the configuration file, it will just assume that the configuration file is located in the directory you're currently in and has this name. And it will let you know if it can't find a configuration file to use. So that's a little bit about how you actually use MinPy. I think another important caveat is to actually think about, okay, so once I've created my time series deformation history, how do I determine the quality of it? How do I determine if I actually got usable data out of it? And there's a couple different things you can look at. The first is looking at the average spatial coherence, which is basically the coherence of each interferogram individually that went into the analysis. And as I mentioned earlier, if you have some interferograms with relatively low average spatial coherence, it's worth taking the time to remove those from the analysis because they can have a really detrimental impact on the overall quality. In particular, creating and molding a good interferogram network is probably the step that will have the most impact on the overall quality of your final deformation map. So it's really worth spending the time to craft a really good interferogram network. The next thing you can look at is temporal coherence. So in this case, we're not looking at what the average coherence is spatially. We're looking at it for a single point, but through time. And this is a good way to determine, okay, what is the overall reliability of a deformation estimate if I get in a particular area? So in particular, if you have values below about 0.5 for your temporal coherence, assume that that point might not be as reliable as other points, and really take caution when interpreting something about deformation in that area when you have low temporal coherence. Another thing that you can use to estimate error for InSAR deformation time series inside of MinPy is some of its error analysis tools. And in particular, MinPy has the ability to use basically a Monte Carlo style analysis to create many different types or many different iterations of a deformation map using different subsets of your input data. And this can basically be used to look at, okay, what is the standard deviation around your velocity estimate? And if your velocity estimate has a very high standard deviations when you're using different subsets of the data, you know that your velocity estimate is highly impacted by the quality of the interferometric pairs that you're using. So you want to be careful when interpreting basically points that have very high error. And this is one of my favorite tools to use to estimate the error in your analysis when using MinPy. I'll often iterate through with a given set of parameters for MinPy and then come back later and then look at this velocity error analysis to determine the quality of the deformation map. And if it's lower quality than I expect, I might go back and change a few parameters and then run it through and look at this error analysis again and kind of iterate in this way until I get the highest quality network or highest quality deformation map I can create. Also, if you're lucky enough to have actual GPS stations in the area that you're researching, MinPy is capable of pulling information from external GPS networks that you can then use to ascertain the quality of your InSAR deformation maps. Now, important caveat here is that in order to use GPS data, you'll have to convert the deformation measured by the GPS data into the line of sight direction of your time series InSAR analysis. But Alex and the rest of the OpenSAR Lab team have gone to the trouble of creating code that will do a lot of this for you. So if you're interested, go ahead and run these steps, and then you can look at how well your line of sight estimates based on InSAR are comparing to actual external GPS data. And this is kind of the highest standard for estimating the quality of your analysis because you're comparing it to completely external data that was collected using an in-field, highly established technique. And then finally, we also include some functionality for then analyzing your data if you're interested in exploring the trends and how deformation in your area is occurring. So you can plot motion transects through time and space, and then you can plot cumulative displacement maps and point displacement time series for an area of interest. And here's just some additional graphs you can use to look at all this stuff. All right, I think that's all I have for right now, Alex. So I think, I believe the plan is from here is to take a quick break. If we have any questions about preparing stacks, Alex can help you with that. And then.
So actually, I think if we could just begin stepping through the first notebook before the break, then we can initiate our everybody's downloads. And then those downloads can proceed while people take their break, because it probably will take about 10 or 15 minutes for those downloads. If people have about 100 pairs.
Okay, that makes sense. Do you want to take it from here then?
Yeah. Right. So there was a question in the QA that I started writing an answer to, but I'll just answer it now. So it was, can we get GPS data for all sites? And so currently the MinPy is using the GPS data hosted by the University of Nevada at Reno. And so there is, I'm going to paste this link into chat. This is also in the MinPy notebook that we'll be going through later. So you can see all of the available GPS sites here. I know that there has been a discussion in the community about allowing MinPy to access user-provided GPS data sets. However, I do not believe that is currently in place yet. It wasn't a month or two ago, the last time I checked. Okay, so the first thing that we have to do is access the data that we ordered in Hype. And so if you've signed into OpenSAR Lab, then you'll likely see a screen that looks similar to this. And if you've built your InSAR analysis content environment, then you should have that as an option for a notebook or a Python console on your launcher window. If you ever want to get back to a launcher window, you can do that either by clicking the little plus button to add a new launcher tab, or you can click this blue plus button over here. One thing just to note about Jupyter Lab, for anybody who's not familiar with the interface, there is a graphical file browser off on the left here. You can click around into different directories. You can also open up a terminal and navigate and perform command line tasks using the terminal. And when you open the terminal, this is a fairly recent update in Jupyter Lab. So if you haven't used Jupyter Lab in a little while, this is just something to note, a change to note. It will now open the terminal in the location that you are currently in your file browser. So
hey, Alex.
Yeah.
Do you want to zoom in a little bit on your screen?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. Tell me when I get to a good.
That's probably good.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, so if I go into some subdirectories here and then I open a new terminal, you'll see that that my path in the terminal matches the location in my file browser. I just wanted to point that out since that is a fairly recent change in Jupyter Lab. Okay, so if you ever want to get back to your home directory, you can just click the little file or folder icon here on the left, and that will take you back to home. And so in the home directory, you should see the content environments directory, which contains the notebook used to create this InSAR analysis content environment. And you'll also see the notebooks directory. And so to follow along now, you'll want to head into the notebooks directory and then SAR training, and then English, and then master. And I'm just going to paste this path into the chat. I pasted it earlier, but I will just stick this into chat in case anybody needs a refresher on that. And I see a couple questions in chat. Can you explain the Conda InSAR Lab? Can I repeat the installation of the InSAR analysis? Yes, I'll quickly walk through the how to install your Conda environment for anybody who may not have gotten to that or had run into trouble with that. So back in the home directory, if you click on the Conda environments directory, you'll see that there is a single notebook in this directory called Create OSL Conda Environments. And so double click that to open it. And one general note about notebooks, they're often auto-saved. And so when you run through a notebook, typically it will get saved whether or not you click the little save button up here. And then when you come back to it later, you may see that that you still have output in place from a previous run. And so here you can see that it says error displaying widget model not found because this was from a previous run, and so it can't render that any longer because this is just showing old output, and it doesn't have the information to render that widget anymore. So if you come into a notebook and you notice that it has been previously run and you're seeing old output, I highly recommend clearing and restarting the kernel and clearing all the outputs. And this is up in the kernel menu, restart kernel and clear all outputs. Say restart, and you'll see that all of the the little numeric indicators that that you've run a code cell are now gone, and any output beneath the code cells are gone, and so you've restarted the kernel, and you can assure that not only are you not going to be confused by witnessing your old output from a previous run, you'll ensure that you have a fresh restart of the kernel, so no variables are saved in your interpreter, and you can just start fresh. And so then you'll want to just hop down into the first cell here, and you can either run the cells by clicking the little play button up here, or you can hit Shift Enter on your keyboard, and that will also run through cells. And so here we've imported the needed packages for this notebook, and then we just ran a Mamba env list, and this lists the current environments that you have available to you. Anytime in a notebook that you see a command start with an exclamation point, it's an indication that this is actually a command line call. And so this, when you insert an exclamation point in front of a command line call in a Jupyter Notebook code cell, it runs that as a shell command. And so you'll also see that later when we get to NetPy Notebook. Many of those scripts we're calling effectively from a terminal by running them in a notebook code cell with the exclamation point preceding the command. Okay, so now we can see that I have two environments, and so I'll continue to run these code cells. This is an example of if you wanted to make your own content environment, you can open this and sort of get the minimal example needed to create a content environment that will work well in OpenSAR Lab and will provide you with widget functionality in OpenSAR Lab. Continuing on, we'll now get all of our available options for content environments that we can create. And so these are all based on config files that are stored in this environment configs directory. And so if you wanted to add your own environment and config and create your own environment using this notebook, you would want to create that YAML and stick it into this directory. There is an assumption in the code here that you have ended the name of the YAML with _.env. If you don't do that, it won't see that. It won't pick up your file. But you can name YAMLs are typically named with a suffix of YML or YAML, and the notebook will handle either of those suffixes. And so in this case, you would want to select the InSAR analysis environment. Now, one thing to note in general about widgets in OpenSAR Lab that often can catch people off guard is that when you run a widget, oftentimes there's the first item on the list is automatically selected. And you'll notice that I now have the following code cell selected, or in this case, markdown cell selected. And you can tell that a cell is selected because there's a little blue indicator off to the left. Now, once I go and I select a particular environment from these radio buttons in this widget, you'll notice that I have now reselected this code cell. And so if I just hit the play button, all that's going to happen is that this cell will get rerun, and my selection will once again be NISAR SE, the first item on the list. So in general, when you're using a widget in a Jupyter Lab, and you make a selection, you have to manually select the next code cell before proceeding, or you'll just keep rerunning the code cell that produces the widget. So to continue on, you have to click into the next code cell and see that little little indicator bar on the left there. And then you can continue running. And so once I've selected the InSAR analysis environment, actually, I don't want to overwrite that environment. So just for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to select a different environment and run this second to last code cell, which will create the environment. It will update the display name of that environment so that when we look at it in the launcher, we see something that makes sense to us. Otherwise, every single environment that we create will show up here as Python 3. And it becomes very difficult to know which environment you're selecting. So this is an important line of code here that uses a package called kernda to change the display name of the environment. And then finally, if there happen to be any associated shell scripts with a particular environment installation, it will run those. And so there are some packages that we install from source, and we clone in GitHub repositories and install those packages from source. And on occasion, we have to set environment variables. And so those things happen in shell scripts that live over in the scripts directory. And so if there is a script tied to a particular environment, then it will also run that. And so now I'll just run this cell, and then this will begin installing the environment. And depending on the size of the environment, this can take anywhere from a couple minutes to up to around 5 or 6 minutes. And the final line here will clear all of the final code cell rather will clear all of the caches associated with your Conda environments and pip installations. And so that can be handy, as sometimes if there is an update, if you have an old version in your cache, it may opt to use that. We've seen that happen on occasion, where it will either cause a conflict or it will use an unexpected version. And so we found it helpful to regularly clear those caches. Okay, and so I'm not going to stay on this screen while this finishes. It will probably take about 3 or 4 minutes to complete. But if you haven't yet installed your InSAR analysis environment, then I would run through this notebook and install that environment. Okay. So now to begin downloading your data, we'll need to navigate to the notebook that allows us to access our data from Hype. Oh, let's see, just looking at the messages here in chat. The select option. So so it looks like somebody is having trouble displaying their content environments. Am I correct in understanding that the widget is not loading? So you have to click through each of the code cells. And then when you get to this code cell, you should see a list of environments that you can select. And then you'll just select the InSAR analysis and then manually click into the following code cell. Okay, I'm going to proceed to the notebook that will allow us to download data from HYPE. So you'll head into the notebooks directory and then into SAR training, and then English, master, and then you'll want to open the prepare HYPE InSAR stack for MintPy notebook. Okay, and once again, you can see that I have run this notebook previously and I have old output in place. And if I were to continue, if I were to start from the beginning and start running this notebook now, I might have accidentally messed up my InSAR analysis environment with the previous demonstration. Let me just take a look. Yes, I did. Okay. So unfortunately, I think I actually did trigger and then canceled a reinstallation of my InSAR analysis environment. And so that's going to take a little bit of time to rebuild. So I'm going to reset my notebook here and run through that and rebuild that environment. And so all right. So the InSAR analysis environment has completed building. So you can see the output from Conda here, and then the output from running the Kernda command that changes the display name. And so the display name is now listed as InSAR analysis. And so this updated the kernel.json file for this particular environment at the path located here. And I will start from the beginning, navigating back from the home directory, just as a reminder of the location of the notebook that we'll be heading to next. So you go into the notebooks directory, the SAR training directory, then English, and the master directory. And so this contains all of our notebook templates that we've used for various different trainings, and on occasion we'll make slight changes to these for different use cases. And so that's what you see in the ecosystems and hazards and HydroSAR and the other directories here. But the sort of the original templates are located in this master directory. And so then we'll want to open the prepare HYPE InSAR stack for MintPy notebook. And confirm that it is in the InSAR analysis Conda environment. And if it's not, if you've opened this previously before you had your before you built your InSAR analysis Conda environment, it probably would have had you select a different environment, and so you may have ended up in something else. If that happened, you can just click on this and locate the InSAR analysis Conda environment that you've built here in the kernel list, and then just hit select. And then once you're in the notebook, you can start running these cells either with the play button or with Shift Enter. And now you can see that this, now that I have the complete environment properly built, it displays the URL to this notebook. And this is going to be different for each of us because we're all in different accounts. This cell here checks that you're in the correct environment. And so if you do happen to be in the incorrect environment, then this will this warning will print and will let you know which environment you should be in, the InSAR analysis environment, and then it will also provide a link to get back to the notebook that lets you create that environment. And generally, all of the notebooks that we have in the OpenSAR Lab repo of data recipes contain these cells that that confirm that you're in the correct environment, and then show you how to get that environment if you don't have it. And moving on, we'll import the needed packages. And then it's going to ask us to define the name for a directory in our current working directory that will in which we'll download our data. So I'll just I'm downloading a data set that I made over Delhi. So I'm going to just call this Delhi. And so now you can see that it's created a new directory here. And then continuing on, this defines the path to that directory as our analysis directory. We define a function that helps us extract dates from product names. And then we need to authenticate with HYPE. And so everybody here, you'll just use your Earth data logging credentials. So assuming that you got an Earth data login account yesterday, and that you accepted the Alaska Satellite Facilities data access terms of service, then you'll be able to authenticate here and access your HYPE products. And so this cell will complete successfully if you've entered your correct credentials. If you get an error here, it's probably an indication that you input the incorrect credentials. I believe if you neglected to define your area of study when setting up your Earth data login account, you may also see an error that will indicate that. And if that is the case, you will have to go back to your Earth data login profile and define your area of study. Because this cell takes input, you'll notice that after having hit enter and completed it, I still have this cell selected. So once again, similar to the widgets, you'll need to click down into the next cell in order to proceed. Now, when you run this cell, it will look through all of your HYPE projects for projects that contain interferograms that have active jobs. So HYPE jobs expire after 2 weeks, and so this will only show you projects which contain active interferograms that you can download. Now, I do want to point out that that I did make one small edit to this code cell that you will not see in your your versions of this notebook, and that is that I filtered for project names containing this string 2022 because I knew that the projects that I was interested in contained that name. One downside of searching through HYPE projects and looking for all projects containing a certain job type that have active projects is that it requires that you open all of those projects and look at each of those jobs. There's currently no, there isn't a super efficient way to flag that. So if you have hundreds of old HYPE projects, that can take quite a while. And to get through this in a reasonable amount of time, I just opened and looked at jobs containing the string 2022. I'm assuming that everybody in this workshop will not currently have hundreds of expired HYPE projects, and so won't run into this issue. But I did want to point out that I made this one small code change here that you'll not see in your code cell. Yet, if you run this in a reasonable amount of time, you should quickly see your projects. And then you can select the project that you wish to download containing your SBAS stack. And then once again, click down into your next code cell here, because in order to proceed past this widget, you have to click into the next code cell. And I do see a question in chat. How do you remove active or passive projects in HYPE? So once those projects are in the HYPE database, I believe that they are there forever. If you do find yourself in a situation where this code cell is taking a very long time to run because it's searching through hundreds of projects, then what I would recommend doing, then what you'll see, this is, I'm putting this back to its original state. So if this code cell is taking a very long time and you know the name of your project, then you can add a line into this for loop that is basically just if, and then put part of the string contained in your project. If this string is in the project, then select all of these and tab it over, then complete this this checking for active non-expired jobs. But currently, yeah, there is no way to remove an old project. And the reason that we keep old projects around is that that we want people to be able to go and re-request those jobs in Vertex. In Vertex, when you look at your on-demand queue and you see expired projects, if you click on the little expired button, there's an option to rerun that whole project. And so that's why we're keeping those projects around. So once you yes, yeah, it does save quite a bit of time. And so this is something that we can add to this notebook to make it a little bit more clear, as I think over time more and more people are going to run into this issue of just having having many pipe jobs that take a long time to sort through. So this is functionality that we can add to the notebook in a future release. Okay, so once you've selected your project and clicked into the next cell and run that, you'll see that you can filter the results that you want to download. If if you don't want your entire SBAS stack, you can at least eliminate some of the products off either end of that SBAS stack by moving these sliders. In this case, I'm going to just download the entire stack. And once again, note that I had to click into this cell before running it after having used the slider. And so now it will just check that everything is in the same orbit direction. And if it finds interferograms that are in different orbit directions, then it will you'll be able to select a particular path in orbit direction. And this is having to this is hitting ASF search and looking at the metadata in each of these for each of these the reference granules, I believe. And so that's why it takes a little while for to run through the entire stack. If you have 100, it's having to access that metadata 100 times. One other thing I can point out is that while a cell is currently processing, you'll see that there is a little asterisk here in the brackets. And then once a cell completes, there's a number indicating the order in which that cell was run. And so that's helpful to identify if a cell is still running. And then the order is helpful in tracking your progress through a notebook. Because notebooks contain code cells and that can be run in any arbitrary order. You can run halfway through the notebook, double back and rerun from the beginning. It's helpful to have these numeric indicators of where you are in the notebook. And so if you continue to run code cells while a previous cell is still running, that will also display as still in process. All right, so that finished, and it only found a single path. And so there's only one option. And it only found a single orbit direction. And so now it's let me know that based on the filtering I've done, I am going to be downloading 82 products. So I came in a little under that recommendation of 100. And then once you run this next code cell, it will begin downloading these products. And so after it downloads all 82, it will then unzip them. So I anticipate that this will take about 10 minutes or so to get through this code cell here. And if everybody else is downloading somewhere in the vicinity of 100 products, then it will probably take you that long as well. So perhaps this is a good time to check in and just see if anybody's had any issues getting their content environment set up. This might be a good opportunity to walk through any issues like that anybody's had. Or if anybody has just any questions in general. I see a question from Dr. Rao. How do you request, or how do you rather select the coherence threshold in OpenSAR Lab? So when we get into the following notebook after we've downloaded our data, you can that is one of the command line arguments that you can provide. And so I think we've sort of chosen a random threshold, but after running through and seeing the results of that, oftentimes it's a benefit to go and make an adjustment to that threshold. And then there is another question, which is it raw data SLC or process interferograms? And the data that we are downloading now, if you've ordered your SBAS stack on Vertex through Hype, or from the command line through Hype, through the Hype SDK, those are all processed interferograms, and so those have used a reference and secondary SLC, and use the Gamma software to to produce interferograms. So right now, these are downloading interferograms. There's a question from Ritwick in chat. Is it possible to include on-demand hype products for the same region by different users with mutual acceptance? In other words, I believe that the question is, can users share, can users access each other's processed data? And that the answer to that is yes. That is a recent addition to hype.
We just added that.
Yeah. And Forrest, you do that by there's now an argument for the username. Is that correct when downloading data from the Hype SDK?
Correct. Yeah, I think it's in the find jobs function of the Hype SDK. You can specify a username, and then you can find all. Then you can search that specific username for a project. So as long as you have somebody else's username and the project name they're dealing with, then you can find the data you're looking for.
Okay.
Probably the best place to look is probably our documentation for the Hype SDK. I'll post a link for that in chat. But yeah, so the argument is user ID.
Okay.
I just put it in chat, Alex.
Okay. Okay, yeah, so here's an example, find jobs call, and there's now an option, an argument for user ID. Is anybody running into trouble accessing their the data that they ordered on Hype using the notebook? So Forrest, do we have current recommendations on citing pipe? Is that in the?
Yes, we do. I think if you go to the GitHub hype docs repository, it will have our preferred citation. And then, yeah, if you go on the right-hand side up at the top, under there's the license, and then there's cite this repository. And then you can copy that to get the BibTeX or the APA version.
Great. Let's see. So I'm seeing a message from, forgive me if I mispronounce your name, Shubham. The kernel is not displaying in the InSAR analysis option. So can you confirm that in your create OSL content environments notebook that you that you were able to successfully run this cell that installs the environment, and then that you saw output that looks something like the following, ending with this section that displays the display name change. If you have done that, and you're still, and you see all of this output, and you're still not seeing the InSAR analysis option when you select the kernel button up here on the upper right, you might try refreshing your entire browser screen. Sometimes it does. It usually takes 30 or 40 seconds for JupyterLab to recognize the new kernel and populate it, but on occasion, it is helpful to refresh the screen. Okay, so Shubham, I see your message there about the conda environment. So when you select your the InSAR analysis conda environment here, you'll need to run this cell following if it could be that you didn't select out of the widget. So once you've selected this, you need to manually click into the next cell. If you're seeing the NISAR SE as the environment that was built, then I think you probably reran this cell, which just reselected NISAR SE and then proceeded. And so I think you ended up installing the NISAR SE environment. So what you'll need to do is go back to this notebook and rerun this cell, select the InSAR analysis environment, and then manually click into the next cell, and then run that and run the following cells in order to rebuild that InSAR analysis environment. And Nalini, I see the error that you shared from the cell to log into Hype, but I'm not actually seeing the error portion. I see a couple of the initial lines, but
yeah, I'll just send it again.
Okay, thanks. So sometimes the two things that I'm aware of that will if you've created your Earth Data login account, the two things that I'm aware of that will prevent you from accessing your Hype data via the SDK at least are if you haven't in your Earth Data login profile, if you haven't declared your area of study, then you'll get a warning related to that. And then the other thing would be if you didn't accept the ASF EULA, but then you wouldn't have been able to create that, to order those Hype products in the first place. And then Narayanaro, I see your message there. And so it says project select is not defined. So were you able to run this code cell and view your project?
Yes, it is showing that found no active projects containing InSAR products.
Okay, so that's the problem. So so did you go into Vertex and create an SBAS stack from Hype?
Okay, not yet. Oh, sure.
Okay, yeah. So in order to proceed with this, you'll have to order those data, and then once you've done that, then it should show up as an option.
Okay.
You know, the project name that you've attached, and so when you order those data, it will request you to define a project name, and I would recommend creating a project name in order to grab all of your projects. Or to grab all of the jobs in with one easy click. Otherwise, you'll end up with a long list of individual jobs that you'll have to select, and those could be mixed in with various other jobs that you may have ordered in the past.
Sure. I'm just creating that.
Just to let you know, it will take about an hour to run that your SBAS stack. So so you probably won't be able to follow along synchronously, but once again, these both days of this workshop are being recorded and will be posted on our on ASF's YouTube channel. So everybody will be able to go back through and follow along, on your own time at a later date.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alex.
Okay, so Nalini, I see that you've selected
Yeah.
the Alaska Satellite Facility Data Access Dev Test, but there should be one that does not have the dev/test next to it.
Okay,
And so
that I need to select, right?
yeah, so if you go back into your Earth Data Login account and
Yes.
select the EULAs tab, then and select the option to add a new app, you should see Alaska Satellite Facility Data Access
Data
without,
access.
yeah.
Okay.
And then once
If
you,
I accept, yes, I am able to see and I am agreeing it to it. That's it,
Oh.
right?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the last thing you said?
Yeah, those are the two things which I need to select, right? For the data access.
So the one that you'll want is, I think you'll only need, you don't need the CDAC website for this one.
Okay.
Let me see. Hold on, I'm just going to pull up my my account just to make sure that I'm showing you the correct one here. Log in. Okay. Okay, so once you're in your account and you've you can select the EULAs and the accept new EULAs. It won't turn up on mine because I already have it selected, but the one that you'll want to select is this Alaska Satellite Facility Data Access.
Okay.
And so there is one that has dev test after it, but the
Okay.
one that you'll actually need is the
Data access.
production version. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And so once you've done that, so you'll click to add that, and you'll have to scroll to the bottom of the the end user license agreement, and then check a box and click to add that. Oh, okay, let's see. Okay, so hopefully those of you who have been able to follow along with your own SBAS stacks now have them downloaded and extracted. And so you'll know that this cell has completed when you see a number in the brackets next to the code cell there. And then we can start working through the rest of the notebook. So this cell just confirms that we have the required auxiliary files. So this is actually, these are the look vectors. There is some ambiguity in the documentation that's referring to so at one point they were referring to angle maps, and I think we still have some of that old language in here, which conflicts with what we've named our incidence angle maps and our look vectors. But this cell does check for that you have the correct data, which just as a reminder, over in data search. Oops. When you add pipe jobs to your on-demand queue, there is an easy option to select the required MintPy look vectors in DEM. So if I add one of these to my okay. So if I add one of these InSAR jobs to my queue, there is this little button here, set MintPy options, that will allow you to select that will automatically select the look vectors in DEM, which are the required files. Okay, so back here in the notebook that's downloading and preparing our data. Here we just remove some unneeded files, and then we will select a subset area of interest. There is currently an update to this notebook in progress, which improves this area of interest selector. The current version that we're about to see merges all of the amplitude scenes from associated with each hype interferogram, and provides those in a plot, so you have a complete view of the area covered by the stack. In the updated version, we're using a base map, so it speeds things up by not having to merge all of those scenes, which can get quite unwieldy when you have a very deep stack. And it also provides a bounding boxes showing you the common area of coverage for the complete stack, and also the complete area covered by the stack. And so, but in this case, we don't have that view. That release should be coming within the next couple of weeks. And so all of the notebooks in OpenSAR Lab are managed and synced every time you restart your server with a tool called NB Git Puller. And so when that release comes, your notebooks will be updated automatically, and you'll just have to rebuild your InSAR analysis environment in order to use those new tools. But here we are with our scene displayed, and we can now select an area of interest. And so MintPy requires that all rasters in the stack of interferograms have the exact same dimensions, and not every interferogram in your SBAS stack may have those same dimensions. So even if you were planning on processing your the entire scene through the time series, you would still need to clip all of those images to a set of common extents. And so even if you wanted the entire scene, then you just would want to draw a bounding box around the whole area. Or if you only are interested in a particular subset area of interest, then you can also define that with a smaller bounding box. And so once you have your bounding box in place for your area of interest, then you can click into the next code cell once again, because this is an interactive widget plot. In order to proceed with the notebook, you have to manually click into the next code cell, or it will just regenerate the same plot that you saw before. And so now we've defined the area that we are going to clip to, and then we will subset all of our data. And so this may take a little while depending on the size of your stack. And because there is the potential for, for frame shift inside of a stack, and all of your scenes may not completely align, but they may be slightly overlapped, it's possible that when you go and select a small subset area of interest, that some of the scenes in your stack may not contain any data in that area. And so once the clipping has been done, there is this subsequent code cell that goes and checks for any new subset TIFFs that contain no data. And if there are any that contain no data, then those are deleted. But in this case, it did see data in all of our subset TIFFs, in all of my subset TIFFs. So no geotiffs were removed. And then the last code cell just provides links, a link to the MintPy notebook that we're going to use next. So you can either click that link to open up the MintPy notebook, or you can find it in the file browser here on the left and just double click the name of the notebook. Okay, so once we're in the InSAR time series analysis using MintPy and Height Products notebook, confirm that you're in your InSAR analysis environment in the top left or top right here, and change that kernel if needed to your InSAR analysis environment. That will also be once again checked in these first two code cells. If you're not in the correct environment, then you'll see a big red warning here indicating that you should change into that environment. Then we'll import all of our necessary packages. And before starting through this notebook, I do want to mention that this is not the only way that you can use MintPy. This notebook is a demonstration of possibilities, and you can use this as a starting point to become familiar with MintPy, but there are many options in MintPy that we do not cover in this notebook. And while we've provided easy access to changing some of of what we've seen to be the most commonly changed parameters, there are many parameters that can be altered. And so I'm just going to open up one of the default configs, and which Forrest showed you earlier, because this is, it's quite long. There are 330 some odd lines of parameters that can be adjusted and adapted to fit the needs of your particular analysis. And so while you may want to start by going through with most of these set to auto, you may find it useful to double back and adjust these on your own in the future. And I just want to make sure that everybody's aware that there are many more options available in this config than what we've provided easy access to in the notebook. And just because the option isn't covered in the notebook doesn't mean that you can't go back and manually edit that config file yourself, and make those changes. So once we get through importing all of our needed packages, there you'll see this file chooser widget here, and so you can click on select, and then just select the directory containing the data that you just downloaded. And so here are all of the interferograms that I just downloaded. And so I'll click the select button. And then once again, because this is a widget, I need to click down into the next code cell to proceed. And now it asks us to define a project name. And this is going to create a custom config file. And so in this case, I'll just name it Delhi, and excuse me. And so now, the wrong notebook or wrong directory. Okay, so at this point, you'll see that there is now a MintPy directory alongside all of your data. With the plots directory, but I believe this is still empty. Yes, so this is all just empty at this point. But when we go and we edit the config options, we are going to create a custom config file named after the project name that we defined in this code cell here. However, before we do that, there is a cell here that walks through the process of setting up your climate data store user ID and API key. And if you don't have a climate data store user ID and API key, it explains how to get those and how to gain access to the ERA5 data set. This was all in that slideshow of preparatory steps for this workshop. So hopefully everybody has done that. If you haven't, that's okay. The tropospheric correction is an optional step in this notebook. And for now, while we run through the notebook, you can opt not to run tropospheric correction, and then you can revisit the notebook later after having set up your credentials and turn tropospheric correction back on and rerun that portion of the analysis. And so this will check and see if you have your credentials in place, and if you do, then it automatically sets the option to not update those, but it also does allow you to update those credentials if needed. And if you don't have the credentials in place, then it asks you for that information. If you haven't set up your climate data store account yet and don't have credentials, just skip these code cells. Okay, as Forrest explained in more detail earlier, here is an outline of all of the steps in the MintPy workflow. And once again, here is the help option. And so you'll note the exclamation point indicating that we are running this from the command line. So this could also be run in the terminal without the exclamation point. And so in this notebook, we are going to step through all of the steps one at a time, as opposed to just sort of running a large portion of the workflow at once. I believe further down in the notebook, yes, there is a commented out cell that would show you how to run to just run the entire workflow on your SBAS stack. But for the purposes of this notebook, we really want to through each of these steps. So, so this is here just for, you know, for your information, but it is commented out. All right, so back up. Here we'll start defining the parameters for our config file for MintPy. So you have to point MintPy towards the location of all of your data, and so we have populated this with wildcard paths that match those of hype interferograms. So you shouldn't have to make any changes to this code cell. If you followed along in the previous notebook and pointed to that directory in the file browser above, then it should be able to locate all of your data. And then we provide a few options. And once again, these are all options that you could go and set manually in the configs themselves. So you can allow MintPy to determine a reference point, but if you know an ideal reference point, you can also define that yourselves or with using the latitude and longitudinal coordinates. And so oftentimes, if you don't have a sense of exactly what reference point you might like to use, you can run through the notebook and let MintPy determine the reference point, see which one it picks, and then once you have a full view of coherence in your data set, you can pick a more ideal reference point of high coherence as close as possible to your area of interest. But initially, it doesn't hurt to just let MintPy pick that point for you. MintPy defaults to selecting to determining a reference scene. And it doesn't always pick the first reference scene, the earliest reference scene in your stack. And so then when you look at your time series, you see, for if things were, your point of zero deformation is somewhere in the middle of your stack as opposed to at the start of your stack. And in most cases, it seems that users are more interested in seeing deformation from a certain point of time moving forward. And so we've provided the option to reference that to the earliest date in the stack, or you can go with MintPy's default and allow it to determine a reference date. Right, and then MintPy also allows for some parallel processing, particularly in, I believe at this point, there are only 2 steps that are covered using a local DAS cluster for multi-threaded processing, and that is the network inversion and the tropospheric correction for correcting the tropospheric correction for correcting the dumb errors, which can both be fairly time intensive depending on the size of your stack. Okay, and so I actually said do not use multi-threaded processing, but that was a mistake. I meant to click use all 8 available cores. So now I'm going to rerun these cells, and so you'll see that there's nothing about multi-threaded processing here at the bottom of this output. But once I rerun this, now I see that that MintPy will use a local DAS cluster and will use 8 workers, which in this case translates to CPU cores. Okay, and so now we have this deli.txt, and this is the updated custom config that we've created. And so anything that's located, any options that are set in this config will overwrite options in the default config. And so if you had any additional changes that you wanted to make, you could just go and copy those lines out of the default config and paste them into here, and then set the values and save, save this this file. And in that way, you'd be able to incorporate any, any additional parameter changes in your analysis using this notebook. Okay, so the first step is to load the data. So it's MintPy will use these wildcard paths that we provided above, right here, to go into the directory that we pointed it to, and identify all of those files, and then load them into HDF5 data sets. And so now, here in the inputs directory that has been created, you'll now see that there is the geometry file and the interferogram stack, and these are now in the HDF5 format that MintPy uses. And so at this point, you don't really need any of your initial data. It's all loaded into MintPy in those HDF5 files. You could get rid of all of this data. I tend to leave it around just because, if you're going and if you want to resubset or make any adjustments, it's nice to have on hand. But but once you've loaded that data, MintPy has everything it needs in those HDF5 files. The reason to delete this is if you were running out of space. So OpenSAR Lab comes with 500 gigabytes of storage on your volume, and so if you are pressed for space, then you may find it more useful to delete the data once you don't need them anymore. And so this just runs ls, lists the contents of the inputs directory to show that you do have your HDF5 files and your template config here, as well as your custom config here. Okay, now we'll run the modify network step. And so on occasion, this may drop some interferograms that lack enough spatial coherence. And you'll see a little readout down here that indicates whether or not any were dropped. And so in this case, it didn't drop any. And it provides some other information that might be useful as well, such as your the maximum perpendicular baseline and temporal baselines. And I believe this is the coherence range. And then we can get a little visual of our network after having run the modify network step. And so this is just the perpendicular baseline history, and so we have this this interconnected network, but this is showing the perpendicular baseline history in time, and then there is the coherence matrix. And so if you're lacking coherence in your stack, then it's likely that you won't see a nice smooth line here. You'll sort of have lots of areas bleeding out into the surrounding areas of the plot here, and if there are this is color coded for spatial coherence. So if there are any interferograms that that have particularly poor coherence, those will be initially lighter in blue and then eventually red. And so that can indicate areas where you may want to go and adjust your interferer, your SBAS stack and remove some of those pairs from the network to keep better coherence. So we have selected the option to have MINT-PI determine a reference point. And so that's what this step has done. And so it has selected a reference point of high coherence. And so it randomly selected a pixel with a coherence greater than 0.85. And this will output the selected reference point, both in terms of lat long coordinates and XY coordinates of your raster. And I just saw a message about the video recording, and yes, we will be posting this again. We will be hosting these recordings of this workshop on the ASF YouTube channel. So it will probably take, about a week to get those videos posted. But then they'll be available for everybody here and anybody else in the world to step back through this entire workshop. So MINT-PI, so while I'm just responding to, I thought I just saw a question about.
All right, I just answered it.
Oh, okay.
But go ahead and answer it live too.
Okay. When you download your data from Hype, they will be in UTM. MINT-PI works in lat long, so we've converted everything over to lat long, which is why you're seeing lat long coordinates here, even though initially the data were in UTM, were projected. All right, next we'll run the quick overview step. And so actually, Forrest, maybe you can speak to this a little bit. This is an area that I'm not super clear on myself. And so this assesses the distribution of phase unwrapping error from the number of interferogram triplets with non-integer ambiguity of closure phase. And so is this isn't potentially eliminating interferograms from the network?
No. So there are unwrapping errors that add constant value to some subsections of interferograms. And this quick overview step is taking the time to look at, okay, how many of those unwrapping errors can we detect here? The way that you detect unwrapping errors is using a technique called phase closure. And the concept behind phase closure is basically, imagine you have 3 SAR acquisitions, A, B, and C. Now form interferograms between each of those pairs. So you have an interferogram between A and B, an interferogram between B and C, and an interferogram between A and C. So imagine like a triangle. If you're thinking of a network diagram, it would be 3 dots, A, B, and C, with lines going in between all 3 of them. The way that, since if there's no errors in the interferograms that you've generated, everything worked perfectly, there were absolutely no issues whatsoever. If you add up the amount of displacement measured in interferogram AB plus interferogram BC, it should be equal to the amount of deformation shown in the interferogram AC. So basically AB plus BC equals AC. And phase closure is measuring, since we know there are errors, to what extent that is not true. And since the original interferograms before they were unwrapped are always between a value of negative pi and pi, we would expect many small variations if the errors are sourced from just the original errors in the calculation of the interferogram. However, unwrapping errors, because they add increments of 2 pi, will be much larger. So if you can find phase closures in interferograms that are equal to some multiple of 2 pi, so like 6 point something or 12 point something, then you know that those errors that you can identify via phase closure are related to unwrapping. The creator of the MinPy software, Yunjin Zhang, created a methodology for identifying those unwrapping errors and correcting them using the phase closure information. And if you use the correct unwrapping error step, it will perform that type of analysis, or like it will apply that correction to your interferograms before you perform the time series inversion.
Thank you. That is helpful. And so it does output this this num-tri non-zero int ambiguity PNG that we could take a look at here. Okay, so based on what you said, Forrest, this is these would be areas to sort of keep an eye on as maybe having more non-closure phase ambiguity.
Exactly.
Okay.
So this graph is telling you, hey, in these locations, there are a ton of interferogram pairs where the assumptions of phase closure do not hold, where basically AB plus BC does not equal AC. So be careful when interpreting any information there. And the time series inversion in those locations are likely suspect.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, and so now we will actually do the network inversion. And so you can see that it's performing this in a number of different worker nodes. Somewhere up here. Yes, it's creating different sub boxes for different workers so that it can run this process in parallel, which substantially speeds it up. And so this is completed, and so now we can move on to the correcting for tropospheric propagation delays. And so this is the step that does require access to the AER5 data set via the Copernicus Climate Data Store, and having configured your CDS API config to with those credentials. So if you haven't done that, then I would recommend skipping this step. However, I do have those credentials in place, so I will run this. This is going to take a little a little while, potentially, and that is really subject to activity in the climate data store itself. Sometimes these download very, very quickly, and sometimes they go a little bit slower just when the site is congested with traffic. It seems like it's moving along fairly quickly right now. And so you'll notice that there are multiple options here, though. So you either run tropospheric correction, skip, but also these delete outputs of a previously interrupted tropospheric correction and rerun it, or delete previous outputs and skip it. And the reason that we have these last two options, which delete previous output, is because if MintPy sees the presence of your tropospheric correction files, it skips the step. It assumes that it's already been done and it skips it. And that is true even if the process is not completed, which because we are retrieving data from an outside resource, the climate data store, there is the possibility for a network interruption. And you may initiate that download of those ERA5 data, and then it could drop halfway through and not complete. However, when running through this notebook in subsequent runs, if you wish to rerun portions of the analysis and look at plots in the future, even if that initial tropospheric correction failed due to a network connection issue, MintPy will see that the file was created and will assume that it ran correctly. And that's not always the case. So we have added these options to delete previous outputs to force MintPy to rerun that step and re-download all the data. Okay, so it looks like it's downloaded the data, and now it is just calculating the absolute delay using PyApps. All right, and now that's completed. And just to give you a sense of the difference in time that it can take to run this, when I ran through this notebook last night as a test, it took about 15 minutes to complete this step, which just now completed in probably about 2 or 3. Now we can correct for DEM errors by running the correct topography step. This is the other MintPy step that leverages a Dask local cluster to do multi-threaded processing. All right, now we run the residual RMS step, and we're getting close to the end of the analysis here, where we'll actually start to see some results. And so now we're going to reference the entire stack to a single date and time. And so if you we selected to use the first date in the stack. So for us, this should reference against the earliest, the interferogram with the earliest date. Or the interferograms with the earliest date. Now we'll run the velocity step, and we can output the velocity. And so this is once it generates this plot. Here we go. we'll see that, that it has the full color bar here, but we're not seeing all of those colors present. It may be when you initially run this that just depending on the specifics of your data set, that everything might be compressed down into the very very small range of values depending on what this is what this has been set to. And so this is something that you could and can and should probably adjust to suit your specific data set. So if I look down here, the data range is from negative 8.69 centimeters to positive 5.96 centimeters a year. And so I have mine set to it looks like -7 and 7. There are a couple things I could do. I could put in this exact range. And rerun this step. Oh. Does this need to be an integer? Oh, it's because I see I had a comma in there. When I copied and pasted it, I included a comma. Okay. So now the full range of values is represented. We can see some of the orange over here and then also some areas of blue. But you'll notice that the 0, the non-deformation point, is not at the middle of our scale, and oftentimes it is nice to have that 0 deformation be right in the center of your of your color bar there. So it may be useful to just go from to keep things symmetrical. So I'm just going to stick to the smallest and extend past the highest value by a little bit, just to keep the 0 point at the middle of the color bar there. But this is really just up to individual preference in how you like to look at and interpret your data. And so now now we know that green represents 0 deformation. And one thing that I'm noticing since we looked at the the areas of non-closure phase ambiguity, non-zero closure phase ambiguity, is that some of those darker blue areas seem to line up with areas that we may not want to fully trust. So looks like right over here and right there. Oh. Or no, actually that's wrong. It was over here. So that's just something to keep in mind, that especially I guess we don't have coherence here anyhow, but down here we've got some data that may be a little suspect. Okay, next we'll perform the geocode step. Height interferograms are geocoded, so this so it recognizes that the data set is already geocoded and skips it. However, if you were using a different processor, MintPy handles a number of different processors. You may find that you need to run the geocoding step. Then there is the KMZ generation, and And so this will produce a KMZ file that you can drop into Google Earth and look at your velocity in Google Earth. All right, and now we will plot the individual scenes in the inverted time series. And so this will show, one cumulative displacement interferogram for each time step. And so you can see that everything is being referenced to the first date. And so at that first time step, there is no deformation. Everything is green. And then we see, we see deformation, inflation, and subsidence in subsequent scenes. And now we can look at some of our error checking and get a sense of what parts and how much of the data set we can sort of trust based on our spatial and temporal coherence and velocity error. And so here is the average spatial coherence. And so you can see that many of the areas in sort of the urban center of New Delhi have very high coherence because there are many buildings that are not moving, whereas in the surrounding areas where you get into more vegetated areas, our coherence drops substantially. And then this will show us our temporal coherence. Oh, and I should point out that in all of our plots now, once the reference point is displayed, well, I guess I'm not seeing it in the average spatial coherence, but up in all of the the inverted time series, all of our earlier plots, the reference point that MintPy selected is indicated on the plot. And now we can look at the velocity error analysis. And you'll note that that the farther we move from our reference point, the higher the potential for a velocity error occurs. So it's important to select a reference point that has a high level of coherence, but it's also important to place that reference point near your area of interest. This step actually won't be very handy in this case because there are no GPS sites in our area. Yeah, no GPS stations found. But I will just show you a little bit about this. So I believe that that there is at least a desire in the community to be able to pull in different user supplied sets of GPS data, but for right now, all of the GPS data that are available for MintPy are hosted by UNR, the Nevada Geodetic Laboratory GPS network. And so this is just taking a while to load. Eventually, yeah, there we go. So you can see a view of all of the available GPS sites, of which there are some in India, but not nearly as many as in Europe or the United States. So I think it would be really, and I know that there are many more GPS sites around India, and so this is an area where MintPy could benefit, I think, from some additional work. And MintPy, by the way, is an open source software package, and so if anybody decides to pick up that work, feel free to submit a pull request on MintPy to incorporate that work. And so, yeah, so there is no point in running this code cell. I think it will probably give us an error because, oh no, I guess it doesn't even, okay, we did incorporate a check in here. Yeah, so there's nothing to see because there are no GPS stations that MintPy can use. However, this would be a sort of a ground truth cross check against some of your displacements that were calculated by MintPy. You can also plot a motion transect across portions of your plot to see deformation. So there was that blue area in our velocity map here. Yes, so I'm going to try to plot a transect across this line here, or that area rather. Okay, so I think it's somewhere around here. I may get it wrong, but I can just replot easily enough. So to plot with this tool, you just click on the map on the plot, and it will drop a point. And if you create a transect in the wrong location, you can just keep adding points, and it will keep adjusting location of that line as you change points. Once you have your transect located where you'd like it, then you once again have to manually click into the following cell. Otherwise, you'll just rerun this cell and regenerate the same plot again. So click into the following cell. And then it will create a plot showing your transects, the location, and and the deformation over that transect. So looks like I missed that area of deformation a little bit. So I'm just going to come back up here and move that over slightly. So I'll hit it right here. Oh, and this is another update that we have made, but is currently not yet in production, but we do anticipate releasing within the next month or so, an update to this plot. So instead of plotting the amplitude image in the background, it is now plotting the velocity. So you have a better sense of what areas you might like to over which you might like to plot that transect. And so you have to do less sort of hunting around as I'm doing now, looking for the area that shows higher levels of deformation. Oh, now I missed it again. Yeah, so as you can see, it will be useful to have this as the background, for the plot on which you actually select that transect, so that you can really hit the spots that you're most interested in. But I'm not going to keep poking around at that for now. If you do want to select a different area once you created the output plot, then just double back up here and rerun this code cell to select new points. And then we will plot the cumulative displacement map along with an option to plot some point time series. And so don't be caught off guard by the blank plot that initially displays. That's because no point has yet been selected for a point time series. So down here, we see that there is a little animation that you can kind of scroll through to look at displacement over time. And so back on the first step, there is no displacement, everything's green. And then as we work our way through, we see cumulative displacements changing. And so if you're interested in the time series for a specific point, you can just click in this map and select a point, and then you'll see the point time series for that location. And you can click around to different locations. And this is an interactive map, so you can zoom in on an area of interest. So this is the zoom option here. If you click on this little square, then you can zoom in, and then you have to unclick it in order to select your points again. So then I can, look a little bit closer and select more specific locations. And then finally, there is a section that outputs many of the output products from MintPy as GeoTIFFs. So MintPy works with HDF5. We've had requests from users to provide some of those data in GeoTIFF format so that it's easy to drop into GIS software. And so we've provided options, and MintPy itself provides options for converting some of those to GeoTIFFs. And where there was not that option, we have added code to do that. So here, this is a call to save GDAL time series dem error, to save GDAL to create the dem error as a GeoTIFF. Excuse me. So this is the full displacement time series. Yes, this is the full displacement over the entire time series. And then we'll also output all of the individual unwrapped GeoTIFFs. And so these would output displacements for n+1, n+2, all the way up through your time series. So each of these are not the original interferograms. These are interferograms showing cumulative displacement at each time step. And then we also output the wrapped interferograms as well. One note that there has been a recent update to the color ramping here. We weren't quite wrapping it in the way that users were expecting to see. And so in our upcoming release, we have made an adjustment to the color ramp to more closely mimic this color ramp here. And so running through these last couple code cells will output all of these products. And there's not much to see with this. It's just populating this GeoTIFFs directory with the wrapped and unwrapped interferograms as GeoTIFFs. And that brings us to the end of the notebook. has anybody hit any issues that they would like to go over in detail now? Oh, I see a note about with the suggestion to have the reference point overlaid on the amplitude image at the end of step 3.4, which is probably when MintPy defines the reference point. Yes, okay. So at this point, it would be nice to have a plot to visually see where the reference point is. Yes, that's a good suggestion. We can add that. It is displayed as well in subsequent output, but you have to go quite a ways through the notebook before you get to that point. So so yes, I will make a note to add an additional plot to that location. I think that's a great idea. I'm not, oh, and I see another question. Is there any way to get the time series data for a particular point in Excel format? I don't know the answer to that in terms of, well, there definitely is a way to do that. I don't know if MintPy currently has that built in. But even if it's not, that is something that we could add to the notebook, although it may already be an option that's built into MintPy that I would have to check. But I will make a note of that suggestion as well. I'm just gonna type a couple of these so that we don't lose track of them. Add an option to output point time series as an Excel spreadsheet. That's a great question, Kathleen. So the question is, if you wish to change a reference point now, how do I do it and not rerun sections of the code unnecessarily? So in this iteration, this version of the notebook, there are not a lot of, we did not offer many options to avoid skipping unnecessary portions of the workflow. However, in the coming update, we have built that in because we did recognize that as a, as an issue. You make one simple little change, you don't want to have to rerun a bunch of steps unnecessarily. So that is coming. I mean, you can do it in this notebook, but it's not straightforward. You have to know which cells you can skip and which cells you need to run. And so so at this point, if you're using this notebook, I would just rerun through the notebook. But in order to update that reference point, you could do it a couple of different ways. So you can come back up to the to section 2.2, where you configure the processing parameters and rerun some of these code cells and click define a reference point here, and then enter your reference, your coordinates here, and then continue on running through this section where it will update your custom config. And then you would want to, I'm actually not off the top of my head, not certain if you need to reload the data. I don't think you'd need to reload the data, but you would have to modify the network in order to sort of lock in those changes. But we are making that much more clear in the coming version of this notebook. Oh, and then the other way that you could change that yourself would be to go and edit the your custom config here. So if you go to the default template and locate the section for the reference point, here it is. Then you could provide that reference point in raster coordinates, XY coordinates, or in lat long. And so you would just copy this out of this config, paste it into this config, and then whichever of these options you were using, you would delete the one you were not using, and then just replace auto with your reference point, like so, and then save this, and then modify the I think run the modify network step. Yeah, and again, I'm a little unclear if you'd have to run the load data as well as the modify network step. I don't remember off the top of my head, but we are building in that functionality into the update.
Hey, Alex, you should be able, if you're just modifying the reference point, to start at the reference point step directly after modify network, and it should all run just fine.
Okay, great. Let's see. There's another question. What is the time series H5 file? So that is the HDF5 file produced when you load your data. No, sorry, that's wrong. That's the IFgram. That is the IFgram stack file. The time series file, I believe, is produced after you do the network inversion, and it actually creates the time series. And so you'll see that you have a few of those. So there's the time series. Okay, there's the time series H5 that happens after the network inversion. Then when we do if you do the atmospheric correction, you end up with a time series _ era 5. And then if you do the tropospheric correction, you end up with the time series era 5 dem error H5. And so you still have your original uncorrected versions, and then you get corrected versions on top of that. And based on, in this notebook, based on the selections that you've made, whether or not you have opted to do tropospheric correction, we account for those paths when generating our plots, and choose the appropriate the appropriate time series file. But if you're working just from the command line and creating corrected files, just that is something to keep in mind, that you want to make sure as you continue forward through the process, that you grab the corrected file, not your original uncorrected time series. So I see a question in the QA Can interferometric data be used for computation of volumes in mines? And so if there is surface deformation resulting from material removal from those mines, you would be able to you should be able to see that. Similarly, if you were, pumping in, if you're like fracking and pumping, material into the ground and causing, expansion of the ground, inflation, then you should also be able to see that. Will it work for in-channel river sand mining? I
believe not.
Okay.
The spatial resolution doesn't quite match what you would need to do that type of work, and water typically produces very low coherence. So it would be difficult to operate in those settings. And then I see another thing I can answer in the chat. The question was, all displacements are not in linear trend, right? Can we possibly fit with polynomial? They are linear trend by default. I believe that you can specify the type of trends you want to fit with MinPy with advanced options. And if not, if you take a little bit of time to learn how MinPy is set up on the Python level, it's pretty simple to extract just the data you want, and then you could use your favorite Python package to fit your data with whatever software package you would like.
I see another question: what files should be deleted to restart the MinPy analysis? So the only file that I'm aware of that causes a problem in that respect is the files associated with the tropospheric correction. And so we have added that option in the widget for selecting whether or not to run tropospheric correction to delete previous files. However, none of the other files need to be deleted to rerun to start over the analysis. As you progress through the steps, they will get overwritten. If you wanted to start with a different subset area, you would need to resubset your original height data. So you need to either have saved another copy of those data, of those original interferograms at their full size, or re-download them and recrop them to a new subset area of interest. There's another question: can I run all the cells together in one go? So Jupyter Lab does provide an option to run all of the cells in a notebook. So if you select the kernel menu, you can restart and run all cells. However, it won't work so well for this notebook or any notebook that requires user input along the way. It will run up to a cell requiring user input and then stall out. And in the case of plots, if there's an interactive plot, it will produce the plot and then continue on to the following code cells. But if you were supposed to select a point or a line or a bounding box in that plot, you won't have done that, and the chances are that those subsequent code cells will will throw errors because it was expecting that you had selected something in the interactive plot. So I don't recommend running through all of this notebook in an automated fashion because there is a substantial amount of user input required. But it is possible to run any notebook from start to end using the restart kernel and run all cells option.
I'm seeing a question in the Q&A about how to tell if InSAR is right for you, the research you're trying to conduct. InSAR is, and the use of SAR data is an incredibly broad topic, and what we've presented here is just scratching the surface of what's possible with these techniques. It's difficult to know what works in every situation, particularly if we don't know much about the field of research you're interested in, but I think the best place to start would be doing a thorough literature review to see what other people out in the world have been doing with InSAR in your field. And then once you get that and have a little bit of knowledge in SAR, you can start to build up an idea of what's possible in your particular field with InSAR and SAR data. SAR and InSAR can do a lot, but they're not magic techniques. So it's important that you go in with an understanding that, InSAR and SAR can do incredible things, but there are still limitations to what it can accomplish.
There's also a question how to apply the coherence mask to output displacement maps so that low coherence maps are shown in a dark color. So right now, those are just any areas that have been masked out due to low coherence are just filled with no data values. So I believe if you wanted to drop an output geotiff into GIS software, it would just be up to you to appropriately assign the color value that you would like for those areas.
There's also a question in chat about how do you use external data to validate the methods. Once again, this is going to really vary by your field, and I would encourage doing a literature review on the topic. But in general, the workflow for time series InSAR is similar to what's shown in this notebook, which is find some external source of geodetic data, such as GPS stations, and then project the measurements at those stations into the line of sight along which your InSAR measurements are measuring, and then do something like a root mean square error analysis to determine, if your results are valid.
Forrest, are you aware of any open source tools for performing a PS time series, persistent scatter time series.
Stamps would be the main tool. I forget.
Oh, here it is. Okay, I just found the. Here, I'll drop a link to that in chat.
And I believe Stamps also has a combined PSDS workflow that you can use inside of it as well, although it's not as advanced as some of the more current PSDS combined workflows. If people are interested in the PSDS space, the same group that created MintPy has also been working on a combined PSDS workflow. I don't know how to say this acronym, but it's the Miami phase linking in Python, so MyApply. I'll link to it here. And then the other good resource for looking at PSDS combined workflows is the tool that's being used for the Opera Teams deformation product, which will be coming out sometime, I think, late next year, but that's using a PSDS method. That one is called Dolphin. I think it's currently in early development, but here is a link to that GitHub repository as well. And in particular, if anybody has heard of ICE3, a new kind of InSAR base processing tool set, Dolphin uses ICE3. And so it's an interesting repository to look at if you're interested in how do you utilize the utilities within ICE3.
There's a question about what resolution the data did I use for the demonstration today, and that was the 80 meter. So is it 20 by?
That would be a 20 by 4 multi-look.
Yes. Will the tropospheric correction take into account rainfall, mist, fog, etc.? Or sorry, tropospheric. So the tropospheric, so that depends on whether or not you ran the tropospheric correction before. So the tropospheric step is just correcting for DEM errors.
That would be I think the topographic corrections, and then the tropospheric corrections. Local weather patterns are such a small portion of the troposphere in terms of the height that they really don't have that large of an effect until you get to the level of, say, a hurricane, or a massive tropical storm, where you might actually start to see some change in the phase delay due to local weather patterns. So no, they don't take it into account, partially because the data isn't available, and then partially because it isn't a major factor for these types of analyses. I don't know where you could find one, but I have seen some really interesting pictures of an InSAR pair formed in an area that had a hurricane, you could very clearly see the signal from it. It was quite interesting.
There is also a question in the QA. Can you identify exactly how much is the displacement and rate of velocity value?
They're asking about the difference between those two things. Generally, they're used as synonyms. Sometimes people will sometimes use displacement and rate of velocity interchangeably, but displacement is it varies more through time. It's the actual thing that we are trying to measure. We are trying to measure this displacement on the air surface, but a lot of our methods only approximate it, say with a linear trend or something else like that. So the rate of velocity is what we can measure with the InSAR, and the thing we're trying to measure is the displacement on the air surface.
So I think we're coming to the end of our allotted time here. And so I think at this point it would be great if anybody has any feedback for how we could improve delivering workshops such as this. This is I guess the first workshop we've done in exactly this format with this size group. So we're sort of learning as we go. So if you ran into any trouble and you can envision ways that we could alleviate that for the next the next round, we'd love to hear your thoughts on that, either in chat or feel free to unmute yourself. Otherwise, I think that we can sort of wind things down here.
Alex, do you want to just flash to the end of the presentation? I think Heidi,
yeah.
We had put some slides in the end just showing some people. If you want to learn about more about SAR and InSAR, we have some good places to go for extra resources.
Yes, that's right. Thank you for not letting me skip that.
This would probably be a good time if you all want to take a quick screenshot. But as you all know, these slides are openly available as well. So feel free to look these over as well. We have documentation on all of our services. The ArcGIS online story maps are a really great place to kind of get a more patient walkthrough of how to use some of our services. And on the right here, we have a bunch of different textbooks or online courses that you can take, as well as some recordings of past webinars that we've done related to these topics. And then I believe we have one more slide. Alex, yep. And then here are some additional SAR training resources. These are some of our favorites. If you're new to SAR and just getting started, this is where we really recommend you start. These are some really great resources, and they'll get you up to speed on SAR and InSAR in no time.
And I'm going to navigate away from this for just a second here to display the QR code for this set of slides. So if you want access to this slideshow, you can grab that here, and I will also paste this again into the chat. And then I'll head back to that final resource page so that you can see those QR codes again. But the link to this slideshow is once again in the chat, so you can have access to all of these links in an easier format. All right, then I think at this point we can wrap things up. Thank you all for attending. It's been a great workshop, and I hope you've all gained a lot of insight into how to run into InSAR in general, but also how to run an SBAS time series using MintPy, and how to find data through ASF search and order on demand products through Hype, and then use those data in OpenSAR Lab. So if you have any additional questions after this concludes, please feel free to reach out to us. I'll stick my email address in chat here again. Oops, that was a direct message. Yes, so my email address is in chat, and you probably also have it in forwards from Dr. Rao, and he also has all of our contact information. So if you do have trouble finding your way back to us, you can approach him, or or find our contact information on the ASF website. Yes, we take user support very seriously, so we will actively seek to answer any questions that you may have. All right. Thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes, great meeting you all.